Ethiopia, a key ally in the West's war on terror, is the biggest recipient of British aid, despite repeated claims from human rights groups that the cash is used to crush opposition. The UK's Department for International Development, DFID, was served papers last month by lawyers acting on behalf of a Mr. O, a 33-year-old Ethiopian forced to abandon his family and flee to a refugee camp in Kenya. The case comes amid growing global concern over Western aid propping up corrupt and repressive regimes. Join Africa Today as we discuss the implications of the case, asking if the aid chickens are coming home to roost.
Mr. O claims he was forced to leave his home and move to a village with no farmland, schools or clinics. He then says he was arrested and beaten by the army. The farmer's case both challenges the Ethiopian government's controversial villagisation programme and accuses Britain of funding forced removals. The lawsuit will be paid for by British legal aid, but no date has yet been set for the hearing. About 30% of Ethiopia's budget comes from international donors, whilst the majority of its 91 million population earn less than $2 a day. This week, Africa Today asks whether Western aid policy is now being exposed by the very people it was supposed to help.
Hello and welcome to Africa Today with me, Vuiswa Ngobongwana. Mr. O's case isn't the first challenge to Ethiopia's villagisation program, but it is the first time a donor nation is being challenged over what its funds are being used for. So, could this case be a turning point in ensuring that aid isn't being abused by the differing interested parties? Joining us for this important discussion are Mr. Bekele Teklu, who's a member of the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Party, Hafsa Kara Mustafa, a journalist and political analyst specializing in Africa and the MENA region. And on the line from the Rift Valley in Kenya is the writer Ben Rollins. He's also a former researcher on Africa for Human Rights Watch. Welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining us. If I could start with you, Ben, there in the Rift Valley in Kenya, could you explain as briefly as you can for our viewers what the villagisation program actually is? Because from what I understand, the idea per se isn't a bad one, is it?
No, I don't. Well, it depends on where you stand. But the idea from the Ethiopian government's point of view is to move people into villages where it can better provide them with access to health services, education, water, and also so that it can try and improve technically the farming processes that people are using so that the land is more productive. And this is happening in many different regions in Ethiopia. Gambela, the region where Mr. Ab come from, is one of them, and it's been piloted to begin with for the last 3 years. The trouble with the program is how it's implemented, is that the Ethiopian government is let's say, tough regime. It took very little opposition. It won 99%. The party won 99% in the various elections. And when it wants to do something, it does it quite ruthlessly. And people who don't want to move, or sometimes who have protested, like Mr. O, have ended up facing some tough consequences.
Okay, well, thank you for that really good brief summary there. But Bekele, if I could come to you, the criticism, which seems to be pretty consistent, is that the government, the Ethiopian government, is actually not taking into account the point of view of the people who are being moved.
Yes. In the first place, the Ethiopian government is using foreign aid for the purpose of its aims and objectives, not for the sake of the people. If they want to disperse... But
in an ideal situation, yes, those two would be the same thing.
Yes. That means, you know, procedurally, villagization is no bad thing. It's good, but there should be a precondition for villagization, a good infrastructure, people's willingness, keeping their culture, and other social and political issues to be considered. Above all, their willingness.
To actually move.
Move.
Because if could come to you, Hafsa, Mr. O is saying he was forcibly removed, and when he resisted, he was beaten and tortured. And basically, he had to flee his own country and leave his family behind, and is now challenging the only mechanism that he feels will have an effect, which is the donor nation. Do you find a certain irony in all of this?
Well, an irony certainly, but surprise, not really. I mean, the bottom line about foreign aid is it's a bit like the sort of IMF loans, which are conditional loans. Therefore, this is aid that is given on condition that certain methods or economic plans are going to be implemented that are not always best suited to the country or that are acceptable to the people. So this is a case in point. This is a case of villagization, as my friend says, perfectly acceptable in general terms, but obviously not suitable in this case, and we've seen the displacements that it has caused.
Right, right, and obviously we did try and get the Ethiopian embassy to actually come into the studio, but unfortunately they were unable to, but they did send us a statement, and I'd just like to read some key points that they made. They said the first point they made is that Ethiopia's track record on spending aid effectively is well documented. Secondly, millions of Ethiopians have been lifted out of poverty. The level of poverty has dropped from 52% to 29% of the population, and by next year, 2015, will drop to 22% with ongoing improvements thereafter. The third point is tens of thousands of teachers have been trained and access to primary education has reached over 98%. Another point, both infant and maternal mortality rates have plummeted. And finally, allegations fabricated by a few individuals misrepresent the current objective reality on the ground in Ethiopia. The donor group has investigated and disproved these allegations. This is from the Embassy of Ethiopia here in London. What are your first thoughts when you hear a statement of this kind? The only point that addresses the issue of the court case is the fifth one, where he says allegations fabricated by a few individuals misrepresent the current objective reality on the ground in Ethiopia. The donor group has investigated and disproved these allegations. What do you think, Hafsa?
Well, I think it is diplomatic speak, obviously, because it doesn't take into account the fact that peace has been restored to Ethiopia, which has been a contributing factor to the return of a certain prosperity, which is understandable, given that there are no more mass refugees, given that the famine has been kept under control. So all these factors obviously come into play when, you know, reading out this series of improvements that the Ethiopian economy has obviously made. I think it's a natural progression from the 80s to reach this level today, and it's not necessarily. I mean, obviously, aid has played a factor in this, no doubt, sure, but there are other factors that contribute to the improvement of Ethiopian quality of life. And also,
Bekele, he says that the donor group has investigated and disproved these allegations. It does seem to point to the fact that Mr. O understands that any kind of complaint made to the Ethiopian authorities will not bear any fruit, and so he's gone straight to the source of the money. What are your thoughts?
Let me just mention a couple of statements. How aid is working against the interest of the Ethiopian people. First, when this government came into power, the first thing was to dismantle the well-known Ethiopian university. In order to do that, they established a civil service college by aid money. In that college, only the EPRDF members were trained as a judge, a lawyer, as administrator and town planner. That is effectively to control it. And then with the structural adjustment policy, IMF came, no, you have to reduce government expenditure, reduce government employee. What they did was they agree with IMF structural adjustment policy and then reduce the government employment. Who?
Okay.
Their opponents.
Okay.
And they use the protection, the safety net protection to their supporters. Recently, to be honest with you, for instance, government, there is a budget support. With the 2005 crash, the British government want to change even the modality, rather than giving to the central government to the government at district level. Oh. But this is a cell is in your home, live alone in a district. They are giving for the same people. So right. Donors are strengthening the power of this government rather than helping the Ethiopian people.
I mean, if I could come to you, Ben, hopefully you can hear us. You may have missed the statement from the Ethiopian embassy where basically they listed a lot of improvements, to do with lifting people out of poverty, child mortality rate, access to clean water. And the final point, which I want you to hear, is they say the allegations fabricated by a few individuals misrepresent the current objective reality on the ground. The donor group has investigated and disproved these allegations. Doesn't this statement basically show that Mr. O's actions were the only thing he could do to get some redress?
I think that's right. I think Mr. O was left with very few options. I think it's helpful if you think about the example of China here. And China is a country that has made big strides on poverty reduction. It's lifted a lot of people out of poverty, but it's done it through very repressive state measures with no regard for the rights of individual people. And I think the approach of the Ethiopian government is very similar. And I think you'd find a lot of sympathy among the Ethiopian government for the approach of China. The question for the West then becomes, do you want to subsidize that kind of development? Is that what you understand by development? And the problem for DFID, and the reason why this case is being brought, is that the definition of development, according to British law and according to UN declarations, is about rights, is about human rights, democracy, people having the right to choose and the right to be empowered and to choose their own future. And that is not a vision of development. That is not the definition of development that the Ethiopian government espouses, nor is it the definition of development that the Chinese government or the former Soviet government was a believer in.
Okay.
So that's the fundamental contradiction here.
Thank you. Well, Ben's got to the heart of the matter, the definition of development. A lot of African scholars have been saying this for decades, actually, that the whole premise upon which the aid mechanism is set up actually creates the very dependency that African nations, post-colonialism, are trying to avoid. I mean, do you feel that this will create a nice, healthy debate around all those issues? Because people have a very simplistic understanding of aid, don't they, Hafsa?
Well, I think this is the major point about this whole case, is that it's going to bring to the fore the issue of aid, which I think needs to be discussed. And I totally agree with the idea that there is something completely wrong happening today in Africa. Africa is if not the most, it actually is the richest continent on the planet. And yet the majority of the population lives in poverty. This doesn't make sense. Something is wrong here. And the idea that an entire continent has to remain dependent on aid just doesn't register and makes no sense. Right. So I think a case like this one is, first of all, it's important because of the specific issues it's highlighting, but of course it is important because it's bringing to the fore the issue of aid, which in general terms and across the continent hasn't really been that beneficial. Right,
right. And it does tie in with a lot of opinion makers and authors and economists who actually feel that aid is having the exact reverse effect that we are told it has. But before we actually get to look at the further implications of this case and some possible solution-orientated answers, here's a look at what you're saying on our Facebook fan page. The first comment is coming from Idris Mian. Idris says, I think it's laudable that Britain has ring-fenced its international aid spend in spite of growing resistance by some members of the British public. However, I do think they need to look more closely at how the money is spent by some of the governments and regimes they donate to. Mr. Kebede X says, I feel sorry for Mr. O and the many thousands of people across Africa that have been forcibly removed from their homes. Land grabbing is a cancer spreading across our continent. Corrupt governments shaking hands with big international companies for vast amounts of money with no regard for their own people, the people they are supposed to represent. And a final thought from Jane Carter, which might reflect what a lot of British people think. Jane says, an Ethiopian farmer is able to use British legal aid to fight the British government against giving aid to his country? Hysterical. Where do you sit on this issue? Let us know. There's quite a variety of opinions there that you've heard. Let us know. And you have also a number of ways you can do that. Have a look at this.
Keep your thoughts coming in. You can email us or text us. Go to our Facebook fan page. Or you can follow us on Twitter.
And indeed, we are looking at possible solution-orientated answers to the aid conundrum. But let's actually address what Jane Carter said, Bekele, here in our Facebook fan page. An Ethiopian farmer able to use British legal aid to fight the British government against giving aid to Ethiopia? Doesn't that strike you as funny?
Funny. For instance, if the Ethiopian government is getting an armament, and if I am killed with that armament, that means I am complaining against the aid that is given to my country? No, this is absurd, to be honest with you.
And Ben, as you hear that point from Jane, it is something that's being mirrored in some of the press who have very simplistic headlines around this issue. But there is an irony, do you not think?
Of course there's an irony, but I think actually for the people who have these simplistic views, the right-wing agenda which says, you know, no more aid to Bongo land, actually they should be grateful that we do have this mechanism to hold British aid to account, because what they would want, and I think what everybody else wants for different reasons, is an accountability of this money. And one of the problems is that when you spend money abroad, it's not the taxpayers of that country who are voting for you, who are taking a hard look at what you're doing. So it's very necessary that this happens, because a lot of people in the UK do not really know where their money goes, and the money's been ring-fenced, the budget has gone up and up and up, and there's actually been a lot of institutional and bureaucratic pressure to spend that money without really a corresponding increase in the amount of scrutiny, and I think that's a big problem for Britain.
And could you let our viewers know something about what Human Rights Watch are doing? Because people tend to lump the think tanks and the aid agencies into one pocket. It does seem that it's the think tanks like Human Rights Watch and organizations like yours which are actually raising the contradictions around the aid issue. Give us a little bit of information about what Human Rights Watch is doing.
Yes, well, I don't work for them anymore, but
I know.
The organisation, it has taken a lot of fire from institutions that, in most circumstances, they're allies. So in lots of other countries where bad things are happening, DFID and the British Foreign Office and other interested foreign governments are paying attention and are trying to put pressure to make sure that people are released from jail and political prisoners are allowed to be free and so on, things like that. But in this case, they find themselves on opposite sides of the fence. And I think the human rights agenda here is very, very important, because I don't think DFID are bad people. They want to see their money being used well in Ethiopia and in other countries. But they're too ready to accept the story from the Ethiopian government that things are going well, and they're not looking very closely when it doesn't go well.
Right.
As long as they are seeing economic growth, as long as they're seeing poverty going down, they're happy. And what they want are success stories where they can spend this ring-fenced money, which they have a lot of institutional pressure to spend, because otherwise they've got to give it back to the Treasury at the end of the year.
Right.
And that's the pressure point.
Okay, let me just interrupt you briefly. Hafsa, when you hear those points there, I mean, no one is denying the improvements that have been made, but I can also understand it from DFID's point of view about not getting perhaps too involved in the internal politics of a given country. They're treading a fine line, aren't they? Do you think they've overstepped it?
I can't fully agree with that. I think individual donations are obviously given in good faith, but DFID is a government organisation, and therefore it follows the government's policy and line of thinking. You know, the old British saying there is no such thing as a free lunch really does have weight in this argument. Yes, there is obviously a desire to see poverty reduced, education levels increase, etc. But there are also strings attached to this, aid, and I think that has to be taken into account. Now, I don't want to go too deep into sort of speculation, of course, but coming back to the point that Africa is an incredibly wealthy continent, the fact of the matter is that a war-torn, highly uneducated, divided African continent really serves the big corporations that are making all this profit from Africa's natural resources. And obviously these are linked to various governments and all these governments that are part of the donating groups. So I think you have to take on board the fact that this DFID's generosity isn't just a charitable act, and there are links, there are strings, attached to these
I'm sure
donations.
DFID members, like Ben said, aren't bad people, but they're part of a bigger agenda, aren't they, basically? Where really the interest of the former colonial powers is economic aggrandizement of some kind. But now we also have on top of that the so-called war on terror, and that basically Ethiopia is the linchpin in creating some stability for access to resources, particularly for military resources, in fighting that war. How big a factor do you think the war on terror is in this particular case?
I mean, to be honest, the war on terrorism is not that much significant as far as Ethiopia is concerned, but that is a camouflage rather. For instance, the USA Army has got, an army base in Arba Minch, southern Ethiopia. At the same time, the Ethiopian government is getting financial and material benefits to crush mostly opponents of his country. Basically, to be honest with you, mostly is in Africa is the governments who are terrorizing their people rather than the opposite. But
yes, but when they're given money to keep going, you can understand why the people are attacking the donors, because their governments aren't listening to them.
Yes.
So they're damned if they do, they're damned if they don't.
Yes.
You know, but I'd like to give a final word. Unfortunately, time is again creeping up on us. Ben, as we come back to the Mr. O case, which actually got us talking about this issue, what do you think the actual chances are of this case succeeding? And if it does, what are the long-term implications?
I think it has quite a good chance of succeeding, because I think the British Development Act and the human rights principles that underline British foreign policy are quite clear. And I think that the link between the villagization program, which is clearly funded by British money, and the abuses that have taken place, I think are obvious. So I think that the DFID will have a hard time defending this case. I think in the long run, what it hopefully will lead to is a much stronger application of the human rights benchmarks, which already exist, but which are by and large being ignored. And hopefully that will mean that there is a bit more of the aid benefiting people in the way that we want to see it, and less of the kind of corporate manipulation and the subsidizing of dictatorships.
And a final word to Hafsa. The people that get talked to the least are the Mr. O's of this world. Do you think there's an opportunity here for the aid agencies to start arguing for saying, hey, look, we have in theory the idea that talking to people on the ground is good, but we actually don't do it. Let's start consulting with Africans on the ground about how to do that.
I think this is the major aspect of this case. You know, Mr. O has actually showed us that it's all about individuals. It's all about Africans who need to be heard. And so far, that hasn't been the case.
Right. Well, and certainly Mr. O is being heard, and irony of ironies, in the donor nation, at the donor nation's taxpayers' expense. That's it. Time is against us. Let us know what you think about this issue and any other issue that you hope we cover on Africa Today. You can email us at the address that you now see on the screen. You can also text us, and don't forget, you can follow us on Twitter. Huge thanks to today's guests, Hafsa Kara Mustafa, Bekele Teklu, and Ben Rollins. Join us next week for another edition of Africa Today. But until then, it's goodbye on behalf of the whole team. Thank you so much for watching.